Florence, 1728. The city was alive with art, culture, and the hum of life. Yet in its shadows, something darker stirred. Vincenzo Moretti, a musician largely forgotten by the official records, moved silently through narrow alleys and abandoned chapels, carrying instruments that no ordinary person would dare approach. Unlike other musicians, he did not seek applause, prestige, or recognition. His obsession was singular, dangerous, and forbidden. From childhood, he had been fascinated by the interplay between sound and the human body, experimenting in secret, observing how vibrations could influence emotions, heartbeats, and even perception itself. People in Florence whispered of him, but few had seen him, and even fewer lived to speak in detail. His instruments were not made entirely of wood, brass, or ivory, as typical organs were. Vincenzo had begun experimenting with flesh, carefully, harvesting tissue to create instruments that could resonate in ways no conventional material could. Each note produced a visceral reaction, a shiver of fear, a pang of longing, or a wave of ecstasy that seemed unnatural. Neighbors reported hearing strange sounds at night, low moans, sudden harmonics, and tones that lingered in the air long after he had departed. Patrons who encountered him described a presence that was magnetic, horrifying, and intoxicating. One tale spoke of a visiting noble who fainted mid-performance, claiming afterward that the music had spoken to him, revealing secrets of his past, his desires, and his fears. Vincenzo's fame, though hidden, grew among the curious and the daring. Scholars tried to rationalize his methods, attributing his success to advanced technique, rare instruments, or psychological manipulation. None could measure the strange power embedded in his compositions. Those who apprenticed under him often vanished or returned altered, their minds burdened with visions, memories, and sensations they could not explain. Rumors persisted that Vincenzo consulted forbidden texts, delving into anatomy, alchemy, and occult practices. He believed that music could communicate directly with life itself, and through his organs of flesh, he attempted to unlock a resonance that would transcend ordinary human perception. The city of Florence became a silent participant in his experiments. Doors would shudder, windows vibrate, and shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally when he played. People reported feeling compelled to act, to move, or to obey subtle impulses while in proximity to his music. By 1730, stories of the forgotten musician had reached beyond the city. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of a man whose music could kill, heal, or manipulate emotion, whose instruments were as horrific as they were brilliant. Some claimed they had glimpsed his workshop, dimly lit and filled with notes, diagrams, and instruments that mimicked the human form. Fingers, valves, and bellows were arranged to replicate organs, tissues, and vessels, each producing a precise vibration that interacted with living flesh in subtle, terrifying ways. Patrons, intrigued by the blend of genius and monstrosity, sought him in secret. They came for curiosity, for ambition, or for forbidden knowledge. Few left unscathed. The experience altered perception, warped understanding, and left permanent marks on memory. Clergy, who usually ignored mere musical innovation, sensed something unnatural. Parishioners reported a heaviness in the air during nocturnal performances, a presence that could not be explained. Vincenzo's influence spread invisibly, touching minds and bodies, shaping the city's rhythms in ways no historian could record. The forgotten musician became a legend, a specter of Florence whose melodies lingered in the streets, in ears, and in the hearts of those who had survived encounters. Even today, the faintest echoes of his organ, crafted of flesh and obsession, seem to hum in the air, a haunting reminder of genius intertwined with horror. Every note, every chord, every vibration carried a message, sometimes warning, sometimes guiding, always unsettling. Those who listened too long often disappeared or became shadows of themselves, haunted by memories that could not be explained, by sensations that defied understanding, by music that lived beyond life itself. Vincenzo Moretti was not a performer for entertainment. He was a manipulator of the human experience, an architect of unseen consequences, a composer of life and death interwoven into sound. He had transcended the boundaries of morality, artistry, and comprehension. Florence, a city of light and elegance, concealed in its alleys the dark symphony of a man who played organs of flesh, and whose legacy would resonate long after the final note had died. Shadows stretched, whispers lingered, and the city itself seemed to pulse with a memory of his melodies. Patrons approached cautiously, apprentices trembled, and neighbors recoiled, yet all were captivated. The music spoke directly to the body, to the soul, and to the deepest fears of those who dared to listen. Florence had been transformed quietly, invisibly, by the haunting power of a musician whose work could not be measured, understood, or contained. Vincenzo's instruments were not merely objects. They were conduits of terror, fascination, and influence, shaping the lives of all who encountered them. The forgotten musician, through flesh, sound, and obsession, had achieved a presence that blurred reality and nightmare, art and horror, creation and destruction. Every note lingered, every chord resonated, every melody haunted, ensuring that Vincenzo Moretti's legend would never fade. Vincenzo Moretti was born in 1703, in the outskirts of Florence, to a modest family of artisans. From a young age, he exhibited extraordinary musical talent, drawing the attention of local teachers and patrons. Unlike other children who played with toys, Vincenzo's fascination was with sound, vibration, and resonance. He spent hours experimenting with small instruments, noting how different materials influenced the pitch, timbre, and emotional effect of the notes. By his adolescence, he had learned to play multiple instruments, yet none satisfied his growing obsession. He sought a sound that could stir not just emotion, but the very soul. Traditional organs and pianos seemed insufficient. He turned his attention to anatomy, sketching human organs, veins, and tissues, studying the ways in which vibrations traveled through flesh. This combination of musical brilliance and morbid curiosity drew him away from ordinary life. Friends and family noticed his increasing isolation as he spent nights alone, drawing diagrams and tinkering with unusual instruments. Those who attempted to engage him in ordinary pursuits found him distant, almost consumed by his experiments. The streets of Florence whispered of him, though mostly through hearsay. People spoke of a young man who could make hearts race with a single note, whose music carried an almost physical presence. Apprentices who joined him often disappeared, and rumors hinted at forbidden practices. Vincenzo rented a small workshop in a forgotten alley, hidden from the bustling markets and city squares. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oils, wood, and something more disturbing, something difficult to name. Instruments of conventional design shared space with bizarre contraptions, tubes, bellows, and objects that seemed to mimic human anatomy. Candles illuminated sketches of organs, musical charts, and esoteric symbols, their flickering light casting shadows that danced eerily along the walls. Scholars and patrons curious about his talent approached with caution, often leaving more unsettled than enlightened. Vincenzo's methods were meticulous, precise, and increasingly grotesque. He experimented on cadavers, dissecting and repurposing tissue to craft instruments capable of producing unique resonance. Each note from these organs elicited a reaction, from shivers down the spine to overwhelming waves of emotion. The musician's reputation remained hidden in official records, but thrived in whispers among certain circles. Patrons who commissioned works were compelled to secrecy. Those who broke it suffered mysterious misfortune. Local authorities received complaints about strange noises, vanishing apprentices, and unexplained disturbances in the neighborhood. Yet they could never trace these anomalies directly to Vincenzo. His presence was both pervasive and elusive. The city's scholars debated his existence and techniques, attempting to understand his genius. Philosophers and musicians alike pondered whether he had discovered a new form of art, or whether he had simply crossed into madness. Nevertheless, those who encountered his music, whether directly or indirectly, were profoundly affected. Vincenzo continued to study anatomy, music theory, and the obscure arts, blending them in ways that defied logic. He believed that the perfect resonance required not only precision, but the raw material of life itself. The organs of flesh became his ultimate obsession. Patrons who approached him often did so at great personal risk. A wealthy merchant once commissioned a private performance only to leave pale and trembling, claiming that the music had shown him visions he could not comprehend. Some attempted to replicate Vincenzo's techniques, but none succeeded. Each failure reinforced the legend of the forgotten musician. Florence itself seemed to participate in his experiments. The acoustics of certain buildings amplified the eerie effects of his compositions. Windows rattled inexplicably, floors shuddered, and air seemed thick with tension during performances. Rumors spread that Vincenzo had consulted forbidden texts, combining alchemical formulas, anatomy, and musical theory to achieve his haunting effects. Apprentices who survived his instruction spoke of an almost ritualistic process, where preparation, observation, and manipulation of the instruments were key. His performances, when witnessed, were not mere displays of skill, but orchestrated experiences that engaged every sense. The line between artistry and horror blurred completely. Patrons, scholars, and neighbors became unwitting participants in his dark symphonies. They felt compelled by the music, drawn to it, yet repelled by its grotesque origins. His compositions were said to echo long after the instruments had fallen silent, leaving a residue of unease and fascination. Even as time passed, the legend of Vincenzo Moretti persisted. His influence seeped into the city's memory, shaping perceptions of sound, life, and fear. Florence, a city celebrated for beauty and refinement, hid a secret symphony of horror in its narrow streets, guided by the forgotten musician whose organs of flesh produced melodies unlike any other. Patrons, apprentices, and witnesses were forever marked, carrying the haunting experience with them. Stories circulated that certain melodies could make the listener see visions of suffering, ecstasy, or even death. Those who studied him often became obsessed, dedicating their lives to understanding what seemed unknowable. Vincenzo's obsession transformed him into both a genius and a monster. Florence's architecture, population, and history intertwined with his experiments, leaving a legacy that would inspire awe and fear for generations. His music, built upon the living tissue of human bodies, became both a marvel and a curse, a fusion of creativity and atrocity that no other artist had dared to attempt. Vincenzo Moretti's experiments grew more elaborate with age. By his mid-20s, he had perfected the design of organs made from flesh, carefully testing their resonance and response. He meticulously mapped the human anatomy, studying how vibrations could travel through different tissues. Apprentices who assisted him were trained not just in music but in observation, patience, and secrecy. Some survived while others vanished without explanation, feeding the legend that surrounded him. Florence's elite, though aware of whispers about the musician, dared not confront him openly. Those who commissioned his work did so under strict conditions of confidentiality, fearing the consequences of exposure. Vincenzo's music was no longer merely a personal obsession. It had become a tool of influence. Patrons reported emotional and physical reactions to his performances, from sudden chills to overwhelming euphoria. It was said that the organs themselves seemed to pulse with life, reacting to both the musician and the listener. Scholars and skeptics attempted to replicate his methods but invariably failed. His approach combined meticulous craftsmanship with morbid innovation, bridging the gap between art, anatomy, and the occult. By the early 1730s, tales of the forgotten musician spread beyond Florence. Traveling musicians, scholars, and curious observers told of his uncanny ability to manipulate human perception through sound. Some claimed to hear voices within his melodies. Others reported visions or sensations of being physically touched by invisible forces. Vincenzo's work became synonymous with both genius and horror. Those who encountered him were irrevocably changed. Their understanding of music, life, and mortality had been altered. He remained elusive, avoiding public performances and official scrutiny. His residence in a secluded alley functioned as both workshop and laboratory. Inside, instruments of various forms, some resembling human organs, others abstract, were carefully arranged for experimentation. Sheets of music interlaced with anatomical diagrams covered tables and walls. Candles flickered, casting distorted shadows that seemed alive, moving in response to the vibrations of the room. Apprentices and assistants learned to handle these instruments with reverence and fear. Even a minor mistake could disrupt the delicate balance Vincenzo required for his compositions. Some instruments were designed to produce harmonic tones, only when activated by the living flesh of a human subject. Rumors suggested that he sometimes used unwilling participants, though proof was never documented. Florence's authorities occasionally investigated disturbances, strange noises, or disappearances, but they could never link anything directly to the musician. Patrons, fearing repercussions, kept silent, By this stage, Vincenzo had fully embraced his identity as the forgotten musician. Recognition from official circles was unnecessary. His true audience was anyone who encountered his work, willing or not. Every melody, every chord, every vibration was calculated, testing limits, challenging perception, and evoking primal emotion. Those exposed to his music reported lasting effects, dreams filled with dissonant tones, moments of inexplicable fear or joy, and an uncanny sense of being observed. Even long after the instruments fell silent, the echoes lingered in memory and body. Visitors who attempted to understand the principles behind his creations were confounded. The fusion of anatomy, acoustic theory, and psychological influence was beyond comprehension. Vincenzo had not merely created instruments, he had created conduits of life and emotion, capable of interacting with flesh, mind, and soul. Some scholars believed he had discovered principles that could alter human consciousness itself. Florence's streets seemed to bend to his influence. Buildings vibrated subtly in time with melodies. Floors shifted imperceptibly and shadows danced in unnatural ways. Local legends claimed that even pigeons and stray animals avoided areas where he practiced, sensing the unnatural resonance of his music. Apprentices who survived reported that Vincenzo's greatest challenge was not the mechanics of his instruments, but understanding and predicting the human response. Each individual reacted differently. Some were drawn into ecstasy, others into fear, and a few into madness. It was this variability that fascinated him, pushing him to refine his art continually. Over time, Vincenzo's compositions became more complex, layering multiple instruments and harmonics. Patrons described experiencing entire narratives through his music, stories of love, death, despair, and ecstasy, without a single word being spoken. By the late 1730s, his reputation had grown to mythical proportions. Travelers whispered of the musician who could control perception, manipulate emotion, and evoke visions through his instruments. Even the most skeptical found themselves questioning reality after exposure to his work. Yet, Vincenzo remained elusive, appearing only when necessary, never staying in one place long, ensuring that his legend remained both enigmatic and terrifying. The forgotten musician's workshop, instruments, and methods were shrouded in secrecy, known only to those brave or foolish enough to seek him out. By blending artistry, science, and the macabre, Vincenzo Moretti had achieved what no other musician had, a form of music that was alive, responsive, and unforgettable. Florence had become the stage for a genius entwined with horror, and every note he played carried the weight of obsession, fear, and brilliance. Patrons, apprentices, and scholars alike would carry the haunting experience with them, ensuring that the story of the musician who played organs of flesh would echo long after his existence had faded from memory. By 1735, Florence had begun to sense the full scope of Vincenzo Moretti's terrifying genius. Rumors traveled faster than the man himself, whispered among musicians, scholars, and the curious alike. Nights carried tales of strange melodies echoing through empty streets, tones that seemed to penetrate walls, floors, and even the minds of those who tried to ignore them. Patrons approached him with a mix of fascination and dread. Some sought knowledge, others notoriety. Few truly understood the dangers of encountering his work firsthand. Vincenzo's obsession with organs of flesh intensified. He refined his instruments, ensuring that each note resonated with the precise emotional response he desired. Apprentices were trained to handle delicate components, learning to balance technical skill with an understanding of human reaction. Rumors suggested that he experimented not only on cadavers but occasionally on living subjects, though concrete evidence was impossible to obtain. Florence's elite, drawn by both fear and curiosity, commissioned private performances. Each session was shrouded in secrecy, the details known only to those present. Patrons reported sensations that defied explanation, chills that coursed through the body, visions of forgotten memories, and a profound emotional upheaval that lingered for days. Scholars attempted to analyze his work, combining anatomy, music theory, and psychology. None could explain the phenomenon entirely. His compositions seemed alive, interacting with listeners individually, responding to emotions, thoughts, and unspoken fears. The city's architecture seemed to amplify his influence. Certain halls, chapels, and courtyards resonated in ways that magnified the effects of his instruments. Windows rattled inexplicably, floors quivered, and shadows moved in time with his melodies. Apprentices reported that instruments required constant adjustment. A single misalignment could produce discordant, unpredictable results. Yet these occasional accidents only reinforced Vincenzo's mastery, turning every imperfection into a lesson and every experiment into legend. As stories spread, so did cautionary tales. Visitors who had attended performances described vivid hallucinations, sensations of being physically touched by invisible hands, and awareness of things beyond mortal perception. Patrons became both fascinated and fearful, realizing that they were entering a realm beyond conventional understanding. Local authorities, although aware of complaints, could not act decisively. The musician's workshop was heavily fortified, and witnesses were either too terrified or too loyal to reveal details. Whispers spoke of missing apprentices and patrons who vanished under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed to have heard voices pleading from behind locked doors during late-night sessions. Others swore that objects moved subtly in response to the vibrations of Vincenzo's music. Despite, or perhaps because of, these rumors, his fame grew in secret. Musicians traveled long distances, risking social censure and personal safety, to observe, learn, or simply hear the compositions firsthand. Some returned awed, others traumatized, yet all were irrevocably changed. The instruments themselves were a marvel of both anatomy and acoustics. Flesh, carefully preserved and arranged, functioned as resonators, amplifiers, and conduits of life. Vincenzo had developed techniques to maintain the organ's integrity, ensuring consistent performance. Each instrument was unique, tuned to produce responses tailored to specific individuals, blending harmonic resonance with psychological manipulation. Rumors circulated that Vincenzo had devised a system of musical alchemy, in which sound could influence the body's vital energies, altering mood, perception, and even physical well-being. Patrons who attempted to resist or disrupt his work often suffered inexplicable misfortune, reinforcing the legend of his power. Florence's citizens spoke of the haunted musician in hushed tones. Some claimed that even in his absence, the memory of his music lingered, influencing dreams, thoughts, and behavior. Shadows seemed deeper near his residence, and a sense of unease pervaded streets where his notes had traveled. Apprentices who survived long enough to speak described the ritualistic aspects of his process. Candles were arranged to maximize acoustic reflection, instruments meticulously aligned, and the human body considered as both subject and conduit. Each performance, no matter how small, was calculated to extract precise emotional and physical reactions. The city's scholars struggled to document these phenomena scientifically. Measurements of sound, vibration, and acoustics failed to account for the reported effects on listeners. Some theorized that Vincenzo had tapped into hidden properties of matter or life itself. Patrons, eager for experience, were often willing to risk harm to witness the mysterious artistry firsthand. Those who left unharmed often found themselves unable to forget the experience, haunted by melodies that seemed to replay in their minds. The build-up of Vincenzo Moretti's influence had reached a critical point. Florence was a city in awe, fascination, and fear. The forgotten musician had transformed curiosity into obsession, secrecy into legend, and the ordinary into the extraordinary. Each performance was a test, a lesson, and a demonstration of his unparalleled mastery over sound, flesh, and human perception. Stories continued to spread, some exaggerated, others chillingly accurate. The city's residents debated whether he was a genius, a madman, or a force beyond comprehension. Patrons became vessels of his influence, apprentices carried his methods forward cautiously, and the streets themselves seemed to remember every note. Vincenzo had achieved what few could imagine, music that was alive, unpredictable, and intimately entwined with the very fabric of life. Every whisper, tremor, and vibration added to the growing tension that defined Florence under his influence, preparing the stage for a climax that would forever mark the city's history. As the years progressed, Vincenzo Moretti's work grew increasingly complex and secretive. Patrons who once sought merely to hear his music were now drawn into elaborate rituals designed to heighten the effects of his compositions. Florence itself seemed to conspire with him. Certain chambers, chapels, and alleys amplified sound in uncanny ways, creating a sense of presence that no ordinary instrument could achieve. Apprentices trained rigorously under Vincenzo's watchful eye learned to treat the human body as both medium and instrument. They documented procedures, adjusted instruments, and observed reactions with clinical detachment. Yet many were overwhelmed by the psychological strain of working so intimately with life and death. Stories circulated of patrons who fainted during performances or experienced visions that blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Witnesses described sudden chills, sensations of invisible touch, and emotions that seemed to originate outside their own consciousness. Word of these incidents reached scholars and musicians across Italy, some eager to understand, others horrified by the implications. Despite this growing notoriety, Vincenzo remained hidden, performing only for those willing to accept the consequences. His instruments, constructed from carefully harvested and preserved human tissue, allowed him to produce sounds capable of influencing mood, perception, and even thought. Each note was carefully calibrated, each chord designed to evoke a specific emotional response. Apprentices noted that even minor alterations could produce unintended effects, sometimes driving listeners to despair, terror, or ecstatic revelation. Florence's officials, aware of the increasing reports of strange noises, vanishing apprentices, and disturbing occurrences, attempted to investigate. Yet Vincenzo's workshop was impenetrable. Hidden in a narrow alley, protected by secrecy and perhaps fear, it remained beyond reach. Patrons rarely disclosed details for fear of retribution or disbelief. By 1738, Vincenzo had become a legend whispered among the city's elite. Tales of his abilities, music that could manipulate perception, influence emotion, and alter consciousness, spread beyond Florence. Patrons who had survived performances described experiences that defied explanation. Visions of past lives, sensations of being touched by unseen hands, and an overwhelming awareness of life and death. Apprentices, though often traumatized, carried his teachings cautiously, ensuring the methods remained secret. Scholars debated whether his music was art, science, or something unnatural altogether. Vincenzo, aware of these debates, remained indifferent. His focus was on refinement, precision, and exploration. He continued to blend anatomy, acoustics, and psychology, pushing boundaries that few dared approach. Florence's architecture further enhanced his work. Vaulted ceilings, narrow corridors, and reflective surfaces amplified subtle vibrations, creating an immersive experience. Patrons reported that their surroundings seemed to respond to the music, with shadows deepening, air thickening, and sensations of presence intensifying. Stories of apprentices disappearing persisted. Some were said to have become permanent participants in his experiments, while others left altered, their minds and bodies bearing marks of the music's power. Rumors spread that Vincenzo's instruments could even communicate with the subconscious, eliciting memories, fears, or desires that listeners had long suppressed. Patrons, scholars, and musicians alike approached cautiously, some compelled by curiosity, others by ambition. Florence became a city divided between fascination and fear. Each performance of Vincenzo Moretti's Organs of Flesh became an event shrouded in secrecy, myth, and dread. Even those who experienced it indirectly, hearing echoes through walls or alleys, felt a lingering unease. Tales described patrons driven to tears, laughter, or terror by compositions that had no discernible structure, yet seemed entirely purposeful. By 1740, the forgotten musician's influence had reached a crescendo. Florence itself seemed altered, every note leaving an imprint on the city's consciousness. Patrons who survived continued to spread the legend, blending fact and exaggeration into stories that would endure for decades. Apprentices maintained strict protocols, documenting every experiment and observation, aware that the knowledge they held was both a treasure and a curse. Vincenzo's mastery over sound, flesh, and perception became unparalleled, his compositions a mixture of artistry, horror, and scientific inquiry. Those who encountered him found themselves forever changed, carrying the echoes of his music in mind, body, and memory. Rumors of his methods, instruments, and experiments became the subject of intense speculation, inspiring both fear and awe. Every chamber, every corridor, and every note reinforced the tension that had built over years, preparing Florence for events that would leave a permanent mark on its history. Patrons and apprentices alike understood one truth. Vincenzo Moretti's work was not merely music, it was a force capable of shaping human experience, bending perception and haunting the living long after the sound had faded. His influence stretched beyond melody, rhythm, or harmony. It was visceral, inescapable, and unforgettable. Florence's residents, whether knowingly or not, had become participants in a grand experiment. Each whisper, shadow, and vibration served as a reminder of the forgotten musician's genius and terror. Vincenzo had transformed sound into a medium of power, emotion, and obsession, leaving a legacy that would echo in every corner of the city, in every mind that had borne witness, and in every soul touched by his haunting compositions. By 1742, Vincenzo Moretti's experiments had reached their most daring stage. Patrons and apprentices alike sensed that his music was no longer merely an art form. It had become a mechanism of control, a force that could manipulate emotion, thought, and perception with terrifying precision. His organs of flesh, perfected over decades, resonated in ways that penetrated the mind as deeply as the ears. The city of Florence had grown accustomed to whispers of missing apprentices, patrons who had vanished without explanation, and eerie music that echoed through empty streets at night. Vincenzo welcomed few witnesses into his private chamber, but those who entered reported sensations of simultaneous ecstasy and terror, a profound understanding of life and death, and visions that seemed to originate beyond the natural world. On one fateful night, a wealthy patron, Count Lorenzo de' Medici, requested a private performance to commemorate an important occasion. Vincenzo, ever meticulous, prepared the chamber carefully. Candles were arranged to maximize the reflection of sound and light, instruments aligned according to precise measurements, and apprentices stationed strategically to monitor every effect. The Count arrived unaware of the full extent of what he was about to experience. As the performance began, the organs of flesh produced a sequence of tones that vibrated through walls, floors, and air, affecting not only the Count, but every person within range. Witnesses reported physical sensations of trembling, chills, and emotional upheaval. The music seemed to anticipate their reactions, shifting dynamically to elicit fear, awe, or ecstasy. Apprentices noted that the instruments were responding as if alive, pulsing with subtle movements that corresponded to the emotions of the listeners. Vincenzo's mastery was undeniable. Each chord, harmony, and dissonance was calculated to produce the exact effect he desired. By the midpoint of the performance, the Count's pallor had changed. His breathing grew irregular, his eyes wide, and his body trembled uncontrollably. Vincenzo, observing meticulously, adjusted the instruments, producing an escalation that pushed the Count further into a state of total immersion. Patrons present in adjacent rooms reported hearing unearthly cries and whispers interwoven with the music, though no words could be discerned. The chamber seemed to vibrate with life, as if the instruments themselves had become sentient. Rumors had long suggested that Vincenzo could communicate through his music, influencing thought and emotion. Now the truth was apparent. The Count, overwhelmed, appeared to lose control of his faculties. Some apprentices feared for his life, but Vincenzo remained focused, ensuring that the musical sequence progressed precisely as intended. As the final movements approached, the Count collapsed, his body convulsing in response to vibrations, his mind overwhelmed by visions that defied comprehension. Patrons in the hall outside could hear the music intensifying, reaching an almost unbearable crescendo. Shadows twisted unnaturally, and the room itself seemed to breathe in response to the sound. The performance culminated in a final chord, held long enough to resonate in the bones and nerves of every listener. A silence followed that was almost unbearable, a vacuum in which the city itself seemed to pause. When the Count recovered, he was pale, trembling, and forever altered. He described visions of the past and future, sensations of being simultaneously alive and dead, and emotions that defied normal explanation. Other patrons who had been exposed reported similar reactions, some subtle, others profound. News of the event spread, though details were shrouded in secrecy. The legend of Vincenzo Moretti grew, blending awe, fear, and disbelief. Scholars debated whether the events could be explained through acoustics, psychology, or some unknown force. Vincenzo, indifferent to speculation, continued his work, refining his instruments and compositions with meticulous precision. The climax of his musical experiments was no longer a private indulgence. It had become an ordeal capable of shaping perception, emotion, and perhaps even life itself. Florence remained both fascinated and terrified, as the effects of the performance lingered in minds, bodies, and memory. Apprentices and witnesses struggled to articulate their experiences, finding language inadequate to describe the profound sensations induced by the organs of flesh. The line between genius and monstrosity blurred completely. Vincenzo's music was not just heard. It was felt, internalized, and absorbed. Patrons, apprentices, and even casual observers became unwitting participants in his dark symphony. Florence's streets seemed to hold the echo of the performance, a subtle vibration that reminded citizens that something extraordinary and terrifying had occurred. Vincenzo's methods, once mysterious, were now recognized as powerful and dangerous. Those who sought him out did so with a mix of fear, respect, and obsession, knowing that exposure to his music could change them forever. The city itself, with its ancient walls, chapels, and alleys, became part of the composition, amplifying sound in ways that no ordinary musician could achieve. Every note, every vibration, every subtle adjustment contributed to the crescendo of the climax. Patrons left altered, their perceptions and emotions permanently affected, carrying the experience into their daily lives. Vincenzo had achieved what few could imagine: music that was not merely performance but an interactive force, a living entity capable of influencing mind, body, and soul. Following the extraordinary performance for Count Lorenzo de' Medici, Vincenzo Moretti's reputation reached unprecedented heights. Patrons who had witnessed the event spread word cautiously, blending fact and exaggeration, ensuring that the legend of the forgotten musician only grew. Florence's elite debated whether his music was genius, madness, or something beyond mortal comprehension. Apprentices who survived the night were forever changed, carrying the knowledge of instruments that could manipulate flesh, mind, and emotion with terrifying precision. Vincenzo continued refining his compositions, exploring subtleties of harmonic resonance that affected the human nervous system directly. He experimented with layering multiple organs of flesh, carefully tuning each to produce specific emotional responses, often creating overlapping sequences that left listeners simultaneously awed and horrified. Patrons attending private performances reported visions of people long dead, sensations of being observed by invisible presences, and inexplicable memories resurfacing in vivid detail. Even those who heard only fragments of the music described physical reactions: trembling, nausea, heightened awareness, and emotional upheaval. Florence's streets seemed to resonate with his influence, the air itself carrying echoes of the haunting compositions. Local animals avoided certain areas, adding to the sense of unnatural presence surrounding Vincenzo's workshop. Authorities attempted investigations, but the musician's meticulous secrecy and patrons' loyalty ensured that no official action could be taken. Apprentices learned that survival depended on precision, obedience, and detachment. A single mistake could result in disaster, yet each successful execution of a composition reinforced Vincenzo's control over his art. Patrons became both audience and participant, involuntarily drawn into the music's effects. Stories circulated of individuals leaving performances permanently altered, their perceptions, emotions, and behaviors forever influenced by what they had experienced. Scholars theorized about the mechanics, yet no explanation satisfied the depth of observed phenomena. Vincenzo had created a system in which sound interacted with human physiology in ways that transcended known science. He was both artist and manipulator, composer and orchestrator of the very fabric of human experience. By layering sequences of tones and harmonics, he could manipulate psychological and physical responses, eliciting fear, joy, despair, or ecstasy at precise moments. Patrons described sensations of being transported beyond space and time, of reliving past experiences with unnerving clarity, and of perceiving the world through heightened awareness. Vincenzo observed every reaction meticulously, noting the subtleties that would inform future compositions. Apprentices who attempted to challenge or question him often found themselves overwhelmed by the very instruments they had been trained to handle. Florence itself seemed complicit in the unfolding drama. Certain chambers, halls, and alleys amplified his creations in unpredictable ways, adding layers of resonance and complexity. Patrons leaving the workshop reported shadows that moved unnaturally, whispers echoing in empty streets, and an enduring sense of presence that lingered long after the music had ended. Vincenzo had reached the pinnacle of his control. Instruments, environment, and audience merged into a single composition, producing effects that defied explanation. The line between life and art blurred as human emotion, perception, and physicality became instruments themselves. Patrons, apprentices, and even casual observers experienced transformations they could neither predict nor fully comprehend. Florence became both witness and participant, its citizens unknowingly absorbing the echoes of Vincenzo's work. Rumors of vanished apprentices persisted, fueling fear and fascination in equal measure. Stories suggested that some individuals had been absorbed into the music, their presence lingering as part of the composition itself. Patrons spoke in hushed tones of the terrifying beauty and power of the organs of flesh, recounting experiences that seemed impossible, yet undeniable. Vincenzo, ever meticulous, continued to refine, expand, and evolve his instruments, driven by obsession, curiosity, and the pursuit of mastery. Every chord, every harmonic, every vibration was measured, calculated, and tested against human response. The city's architecture amplified the effect, turning streets, halls, and rooms into conduits of emotion and perception. The forgotten musician had transcended mere performance. He had created an interactive, living art form that influenced mind, body, and soul. Patrons left altered, apprentices haunted by their experiences, and Florence itself remained steeped in the echo of the music. The climax of Vincenzo Moretti's work left an indelible mark on history, blending art, horror, and genius into a phenomenon that would be whispered for generations. His influence was both tangible and spectral, leaving listeners forever changed, cities subtly altered, and legends that would endure long after his physical presence faded from memory. In the wake of Vincenzo Moretti's climactic performances, Florence struggled to comprehend the full extent of what had transpired. Patrons who had witnessed the organs of flesh firsthand found their lives irrevocably altered. Some were consumed by obsession, returning repeatedly to the musician's chamber despite the toll on their minds and bodies. Others sought solace in avoidance, trying to block the memories and sensations that refused to fade. Stories of missing apprentices continued, adding an aura of dread to the city. Scholars attempted to record and analyze the phenomenon, but conventional science proved inadequate. Observations of harmonic resonance, physiological responses, and psychological effects suggested possibilities beyond known principles. Vincenzo, ever meticulous, ensured that knowledge remained tightly controlled, accessible only to those he deemed capable of understanding and surviving the experience. Patrons began documenting their reactions, albeit secretly, compiling journals filled with hallucinations, emotional upheavals, and profound shifts in perception. Florence's elite debated whether the performances were a form of art, a scientific experiment, or an unnatural influence that violated moral and natural laws. The city itself seemed haunted. Nights carried whispers, vibrations, and unexplainable sensations that reminded residents of the musician's presence. People reported seeing shadows move in time with melodies that no longer played, and subtle changes in architecture seemed to echo his compositions. Vincenzo's influence extended beyond the chamber. Patrons, apprentices, and casual listeners unknowingly carried fragments of his music, shaping conversations, thoughts, and emotions. Some reported recurring dreams filled with haunting harmonics, visions of organ pipes fashioned from flesh, and sensations of being both observer and instrument. Attempts to replicate the phenomenon outside Vincenzo's supervision failed. Instruments lacked the precision, alignment, and delicate tuning required to evoke the intended effects. Patrons experimented with the physical and psychological techniques, but the resonance, subtlety, and mastery remained unique to the forgotten musician. Apprentices reflected on their experiences with a mixture of pride, fear, and trauma. Some felt they had touched genius. Others feared the moral and spiritual consequences of manipulating flesh, sound, and human perception so intimately. Florence's society began to shift subtly. Certain streets and neighborhoods carried the memory of performances. Travelers entering the city reported strange sensations, feelings of unease, and fleeting melodies that seemed impossible to trace. Patrons who had survived intense exposure to Vincenzo's work often became advisors, critics, or clandestine supporters, spreading knowledge selectively while attempting to protect the uninitiated from harm. Vincenzo's methods, while secretive, inspired fear, fascination, and envy among contemporary musicians. Few dared attempt imitation, and those who tried found themselves unprepared for the psychological intensity required. Local authorities remained largely powerless. While reports of missing individuals and disturbances circulated, the tangible evidence was minimal. Patrons and witnesses were reluctant to speak openly, fearful of reprisal or ridicule. The aftermath of Vincenzo Moretti's work was not merely individual, it affected the city as a whole. Structures, streets, and buildings seemed to resonate subtly with lingering echoes of his music. Children reported unexplained sensations, animals avoided certain areas, and even the air itself felt charged with an unseen presence. Patrons and apprentices who survived were forever marked. Their reactions, memories, and even physiological responses bore the imprint of exposure. Some became obsessed with further understanding, others withdrawn, traumatized, or driven to madness. Scholars documented experiences as best as they could, often using metaphors and analogy, yet none could fully capture the extraordinary nature of the phenomena. Florence's reputation shifted, whispered stories of the haunted musician attracting both curiosity and dread. Patrons from distant cities arrived seeking glimpses of his work, driven by ambition, fascination, or the desire to witness a force beyond comprehension. Vincenzo himself remained largely hidden, observing reactions with meticulous care. His focus never wavered. The music, the instruments, and the precise manipulation of human perception consumed him entirely. Apprentices were trained in secrecy, learning the art and science of organs of flesh, the manipulation of harmonic resonance, and the psychological management of patrons. Each session became a lesson, each performance a study in the intersection of life, sound, and perception. Florence's elite continued to debate morality, ethics, and legality, while the city itself absorbed the echoes of Vincenzo's genius. Patrons continued to carry the music within them, influencing those around them through subtle psychological resonance. Attempts to write or speak about the phenomenon outside closed circles were met with skepticism, disbelief, or ridicule. Yet within Florence, the memory persisted. Whispers of haunting melodies, the subtle manipulation of emotions, and the terrifying precision of Vincenzo's performances became part of the city's lore. Patrons and apprentices alike recognized that they were participants in a unique intersection of art, science, and terror. The forgotten musician's influence had transcended the performance itself, leaving lasting impressions that would define Florence's cultural and psychological landscape for decades to come. The continued impact of Vincenzo Moretti's work became increasingly evident across Florence. Patrons who had once approached his performances with curiosity now exhibited lingering changes in temperament, perception, and behavior. Some displayed obsessive tendencies, replaying the music in their minds, analyzing its effects on themselves and others. Others withdrew from society, unable to reconcile the intense emotions and visions they had experienced. Stories of vanished apprentices persisted, adding to the atmosphere of dread surrounding Vincenzo's workshops. Scholars and philosophers attempted to explain the phenomenon through theory, conjecture, or emerging science, yet none could fully account for the interplay of harmonic resonance, psychological manipulation, and the visceral impact of his instruments. Patrons carefully guarded their experiences, creating a network of witnesses who maintained the legend while protecting the uninitiated from exposure. Rumors suggested that those who left the chamber unprepared suffered lasting psychological damage, including chronic visions, paranoia, and involuntary emotional responses to seemingly innocuous stimuli. The organs of flesh had transcended their physical presence. Their influence extended into memory, subconscious thought, and emotional regulation. Apprentices reflected on their participation with a mixture of reverence and fear, recognizing that they had been part of a singular, terrifying experiment that blended artistry, science, and moral ambiguity. Florence itself seemed to bear the imprint of Vincenzo's work. The city's architecture amplified residual vibrations, creating subtle cues that affected perception and mood. Even months after a performance, residents reported sensations of unease, whispers, and fleeting musical echoes in alleys, halls, and chapels. Patrons who attempted to share their experiences with outsiders were met with skepticism, ridicule, or disbelief, reinforcing the exclusivity and secrecy of Vincenzo's work. The elite circles of Florence became increasingly divided. Some feared the moral implications, others were captivated by the artistry, while a select few sought further exposure to enhance personal influence, understanding, or power. Vincenzo remained meticulous in his control, ensuring apprentices and patrons adhered to strict protocols. Each composition was carefully documented, instruments maintained with precision, and emotional responses recorded to inform future performances. By the mid-1740s, the legend of the forgotten musician had spread beyond Florence, inspiring curiosity and horror in distant cities. Patrons traveled great distances, hoping to witness or participate in the unparalleled fusion of music, anatomy, and psychology. Yet access remained limited, controlled, and perilous. Scholars attempted to replicate the methods but failed to capture the subtle manipulations that made Vincenzo's performances unique. Instruments required exacting craftsmanship, precise alignment, and delicate interaction with human physiology. Any deviation risked disaster, both for the listener and the performer. Florence became a city haunted by memory and sensation. Shadows moved unnaturally. Air felt charged, and whispers seemed to originate from unseen sources. Patrons returning from performances found themselves unable to separate daily life from residual effects of the music. Some experienced uncontrollable emotional swings, vivid hallucinations, and recurring dreams of instruments constructed from flesh. Apprentices struggled with guilt, trauma, and obsession, knowing the knowledge they carried was both extraordinary and dangerous. Vincenzo's mastery of perception, resonance, and human physiology elevated his work beyond mere artistry. His compositions manipulated reality itself, bending the senses, mind, and emotions of those exposed. Patrons were transformed, often permanently, their interactions with society altered in subtle or profound ways. Florence's history, culture, and psychology were indelibly shaped by the presence of Vincenzo Moretti and his organs of flesh. Patrons, apprentices, and citizens alike carried the legacy of his work, consciously or not, influencing generations through memory, legend, and ongoing psychological effects. Scholars, patrons, and apprentices all understood one essential truth. Vincenzo's work was both a masterpiece and a curse, capable of elevating or destroying those who encountered it. Florence became an unwitting participant in a grand, terrifying experiment that blended art, science, and the occult. The aftermath was not merely a reflection of events. It was an enduring state of altered perception, emotional resonance, and cultural transformation. The forgotten musician's influence persisted through the city's architecture, the memories of patrons, and the subtle, lingering effects of harmonic resonance on all who had encountered his work. Patrons, apprentices, and the wider population experienced Florence not as it had been, but through the filter of Vincenzo's music, forever changed by its haunting power. Even decades after Vincenzo Moretti's final known performances, Florence remained shrouded in mystery. Scholars, patrons, and apprentices alike debated the true nature of his instruments and methods. Were they purely musical creations, sophisticated scientific tools, or vessels of something unnatural? Attempts to replicate the organs of flesh failed repeatedly, leaving only fragments of knowledge preserved by those who had witnessed their effects firsthand. Tales persisted of lost apprentices who had disappeared entirely, leaving behind no trace but whispers and fragmented journals describing visions, sensations, and encounters with the unimaginable. Patrons who survived long exposure to his music continued to report subtle, unexplainable changes in perception, emotional response, and even physical sensation. Some described hearing faint harmonics in empty rooms, feeling chills as invisible vibrations brushed against their skin, or experiencing spontaneous visions tied to events long past. Florence itself seemed to participate in the mystery. Buildings, streets, and alleys amplified residual echoes of Vincenzo's work, creating subtle atmospheric effects that altered perception for anyone present. Animals avoided certain areas, while citizens reported faint, inexplicable sensations reminiscent of his compositions. Attempts to analyze or explain these phenomena scientifically were inconclusive. The instruments were gone, yet their influence lingered. Scholars speculated about harmonic resonance, psychological conditioning, and the power of suggestion, but none could fully account for the experiences of those exposed. Patrons and apprentices spoke cautiously, often using metaphor and analogy to describe phenomena that defied literal explanation. Some whispered that Vincenzo had discovered ways to manipulate not just sound and emotion, but consciousness itself. Those who ventured too close to the workshops reported temporary madness, heightened sensory perception, and visions that blurred the line between life and death. Florence became a city divided between belief and skepticism. Some dismissed the tales as legend, Others treated them as truth, and a few became obsessed with uncovering hidden techniques or surviving direct exposure. Stories of the music's lingering effects persisted, carried by word of mouth, journals, and secret correspondence. Patrons reported recurring dreams, hallucinations, and involuntary emotional reactions connected to the harmonic structures Vincenzo had employed. The city itself became a participant in the ongoing mystery, each alley, chamber, and hall subtly resonating with traces of the forgotten musician's work. Scholars theorize that the compositions had imprinted themselves into the minds and bodies of patrons, apprentices, and perhaps even the city's architecture. Psychological and physiological studies proved insufficient. The influence seemed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, affecting perception, cognition, and emotion. Stories emerged of people experiencing visions tied to the instruments, often accompanied by overwhelming feelings of ecstasy, terror, or insight. Patrons and apprentices spoke of invisible presences, whispers in empty rooms, and subtle movements of shadows and light that mirrored the compositions. Some claimed that Vincenzo's work had unlocked a doorway into a hidden realm of perception, a place where sound, life, and consciousness intertwined in ways impossible to articulate. Attempts to document the phenomenon were fraught with difficulty. Language proved inadequate to describe experiences that defied the ordinary senses. Journals became cryptic, filled with fragmented observations, symbols, and diagrams that hinted at methods, effects, and dangers. Patrons who attempted to share their experiences faced skepticism, ridicule, or disbelief, reinforcing the secrecy surrounding the musician's legacy. Over time, Florence itself seemed to absorb the mystery, carrying echoes in walls, streets, and air. Citizens reported fleeting sensations of music, invisible touches or emotional shifts unaccountable by external causes. Even decades later, visitors unfamiliar with Vincenzo's history felt unease, the subtle resonance of his work manifesting without explanation. Apprentices reflected on their experiences with ambivalence, pride in having been part of something unique, mixed with fear of the consequences of exposure. Some documented the events meticulously, while others destroyed evidence to prevent misuse or misunderstanding. Patrons, whether through fear or reverence, treated knowledge of the compositions as sacred, sharing only with those deemed prepared. The enduring mystery became part of Florence's cultural and psychological identity. Every whispered tale, every subtle echo in hallways or chapels, every reaction of animals and humans alike contributed to an atmosphere that blurred reality, legend, and perception. Scholars, mystics, and musicians attempted to decipher Vincenzo's techniques, often concluding that his genius lay not solely in sound or instrument, but in his understanding of human perception, consciousness, and emotion. Patrons reported that even fragments of compositions could evoke profound reactions, leaving them questioning the boundary between mind and music. Florence had become an unwitting participant in an ongoing experiment, the city itself a stage for effects that transcended conventional understanding. Patrons and apprentices alike recognized that Vincenzo Moretti's work would never be fully understood. The instruments, the compositions, and the manipulations had left a legacy that persisted invisibly, haunting lives, memories, and the very architecture of the city. The mystery endured, whispered across generations, shaping perception, behavior, and legend. Those who sought the truth were drawn into layers of experience, perception, and emotion that defied explanation, leaving Florence forever marked by the presence of the forgotten musician. As years passed, the enigma surrounding Vincenzo Moretti only deepened. Patrons who had been exposed to his organs of flesh continued to experience unexplainable phenomena. Some reported hearing faint harmonics in the quietest of moments, as if the instruments themselves existed beyond time and space. Others felt subtle shifts in perception, emotions swelling or receding without cause, leaving them unsure where memory ended and reality began. Scholars, though intrigued, struggled to quantify these effects. Psychological studies, acoustic analyses, and physiological measurements revealed patterns, yet none fully explained the visceral and emotional impact of Vincenzo's music. Florence became a city of half-truths and whispered stories. Children growing up near abandoned workshops or old performance halls reported unusual sensations, shadows moving unnaturally, fleeting melodies, and feelings of being observed. Animals behaved unpredictably, often avoiding areas where residual resonance was strongest. Patrons documented these phenomena cautiously, aware that full disclosure might invite skepticism or disbelief. Apprentices carried the weight of knowledge, balancing pride and mastery with fear of the moral and psychological consequences. Some withdrew from society, haunted by memories of compositions and the sensations induced by the organs of flesh. Attempts to recreate or study the instruments outside Vincenzo's supervision consistently failed. Replicas lacked the subtle precision and interaction with human perception that had defined his work. Patrons discovered that even minor deviations rendered the effects weak or uncontrollable. Over time, the legend of Vincenzo Moretti became inseparable from Florence itself. Buildings, streets, and open spaces resonated faintly with past performances, leaving subtle imprints on anyone who passed. Citizens, even unaware of the musician's history, reported unease, fleeting visions, or inexplicable emotional responses. Patrons who survived multiple performances described profound changes in cognition, empathy, and perception. Some believed they could sense others' emotions with unnatural clarity, while others reported involuntary visions of distant places or historical events. Scholars theorized that Vincenzo had discovered methods to manipulate consciousness, encoding effects within harmonic structures that persisted beyond direct exposure. Apprentices reflected on their training with both awe and dread. Each lesson in the manipulation of flesh, sound, and perception revealed both genius and danger. Mistakes could result in permanent psychological harm, yet mastery offered unparalleled understanding of human emotion and experience. Florence itself had become a living testament to Vincenzo's influence. Architectural acoustics, atmospheric conditions, and the subtle vibrations of the city amplified lingering echoes of his work. Patrons, apprentices, and ordinary citizens alike became part of an ongoing, invisible performance. Observers noted that residual effects often manifested subtly, a shadow shifting unexpectedly, a sudden emotional swell, or a fleeting sense of being watched. These phenomena persisted across generations, reinforcing the legend while remaining largely inexplicable. Patrons occasionally attempted to share their experiences, but language proved insufficient. Metaphor, analogy, and symbolism were used to describe occurrences that defied straightforward description. As time passed, some began to believe that Vincenzo's work had unlocked a permanent alteration of perception, a subtle integration of sound, emotion, and consciousness that transcended ordinary human experience. Mystics and scholars speculated about the possibility of a hidden dimension, a psychological or spiritual space accessible only through exposure to the organs of flesh. Patrons and apprentices alike came to accept that the musician's genius had created a bridge between the known and unknown, a realm where music, life, and perception were inseparably intertwined. Florence's cultural and psychological landscape had been permanently transformed. Citizens, intentionally or not, carried the echoes of the forgotten musician, and even those who had never witnessed a performance felt the residual effects. Scholars continued to debate the limits of science, psychology, and art in explaining these phenomena. Patrons and apprentices maintained secrecy, knowing that the true nature of Vincenzo's work could not be fully revealed without risk. The mystery of Vincenzo Moretti endured, a complex interplay of sound, perception, emotion, and legacy. Florence remained both witness and participant, its architecture, atmosphere, and inhabitants subtly shaped by the memory and influence of the organs of flesh. Patrons understood that exposure could never be undone. The effects persisted beyond time, memory, and observation. Vincenzo's music, though silent in the present, resonated invisibly, creating a living, breathing legacy that continued to shape those who encountered it. The mystery was not simply the instruments, compositions, or performances. It was the enduring, unexplainable influence that remained long after the music ended. Patrons, apprentices, and citizens lived within a city subtly orchestrated by the genius, obsession, and terror of the forgotten musician. Even decades later, whispers of unexplainable sensations, fleeting melodies, and emotional disturbances reminded Florence that the mystery was real, permanent, and unfathomable. Vincenzo Moretti's legacy lingered as a shadow over Florence, a haunting presence that refused to fade. Patrons who had survived the organs of flesh performances carried permanent marks on mind and body. Memories of melodies, harmonics, and visceral sensations haunted them in solitude and society, Their emotions, once ordinary, became intertwined with echoes of the forgotten musician's compositions. Many found themselves unable to distinguish between natural reaction and induced perception. The city itself seemed to absorb the remnants of his work. Even areas where he had never performed carried residual impressions, subtle vibrations that caused unease, fascination, or terror. Scholars debated endlessly whether Vincenzo's genius was artistic, scientific, or supernatural. Some claimed he had discovered a method to manipulate life itself, blending emotion, physiology, and perception into a singular, inescapable force. Patrons who returned to the workshop reported glimpses of apprentices long vanished, shadows of past performances, and sensations that defied explanation. Florence became a city living within the memory of sound, a place where streets and buildings held stories invisible to the untrained eye. Children sensed the lingering presence without understanding. Animals reacted with avoidance or anxiety, and even the wind seemed to carry fragments of compositions. Apprentices reflected on the duality of their experiences, pride in having witnessed genius, and fear of having participated in something morally and psychologically dangerous. The organs of flesh had transcended their physical existence, imprinting influence on the minds and emotions of all exposed. Patrons carried both reverence and terror, understanding that their lives had been altered permanently. Scholars, despite extensive study, could only describe approximations. Conventional science, psychology, and acoustics fell short of explaining how harmonic structures could impact perception so profoundly. Even decades later, those who had survived the performances described involuntary reactions, recurring visions, and subtle manipulations of emotion. Florence's streets, architecture, and atmosphere became living reminders of the musician's work. Patrons spoke of whispers in empty corridors, fleeting shadows, and emotional tides rising and falling without cause. The line between memory and reality blurred, and the city itself seemed alive with residual harmonics. Vincenzo Moretti had achieved a level of mastery that transcended ordinary understanding, blending sound, flesh, and human perception into a haunting art form. His compositions were no longer mere performances. They were lasting forces that shaped thought, emotion, and behavior. Patrons understood that exposure had irreversible consequences. Many attempted to avoid recalling specific sequences, fearing psychological breakdown. Others were drawn compulsively to memory, unable to resist the allure of genius and terror intertwined. Florence became a city both enchanted and cursed, its citizens living in the shadow of the forgotten musician. Apprentices who survived carried knowledge both revered and feared, understanding the danger inherent in replicating or tampering with Vincenzo's methods. Patrons, scholars, and citizens all became participants in an ongoing interaction with memory, perception, and subtle influence. Stories of vanished individuals, haunted buildings, and lingering effects created an aura of fear and fascination. Even those unaware of the musician's work experienced subtle shifts in perception, emotional intensity, and sensation. Florence had become a living composition, a city orchestrated by echoes, memory, and the indelible mark of genius. Patrons frequently reported that simple sounds, architectural echoes, or fleeting visual impressions could trigger responses once elicited by the organs of flesh. Memory acted as conduit, perpetuating influence across decades. Scholars attempted to codify observations into theory, yet all efforts fell short of capturing the full scope. Vincenzo's influence had transcended instruments, compositions, and direct exposure, embedding itself into the human mind and city environment. Patrons' lives were permanently intertwined with the legacy, their emotions, choices, and even physical reactions, subtly guided by what they had experienced. Florence became a city in constant dialogue with the past, a place where history, legend, and perception coalesced into ongoing narrative. Patrons, apprentices, and observers alike found themselves living within an extended composition, subject to the unseen, unmeasurable effects of genius. The city's culture, psychology, and atmosphere bore traces of Vincenzo's work, shaping artistic expression, social interaction, and individual perception. His mastery over sound, flesh, and perception created a haunting reflection that endured long after his presence faded. Even those who had never witnessed a performance felt echoes, whispers, subtle shifts in mood, fleeting sensations, and an intangible awareness of something extraordinary and terrifying. Florence remained a city alive with resonance, a permanent testament to the forgotten musician's power. Patrons understood that his legacy was inescapable, a blend of genius, horror, and lasting influence that shaped both mind and city. The ending was not a conclusion but an enduring presence, woven into life, memory, and environment. Vincenzo Moretti had created a phenomenon that transcended mortality, leaving Florence forever marked by the music, instruments, and genius of a man whose work merged art, science, and the unknown. Vincenzo Moretti's presence remained a silent force throughout Florence, an invisible thread weaving through streets, homes, and the memories of those exposed to his organs of flesh. Patrons often described involuntary reactions to subtle stimuli. A note struck on an unrelated instrument, a fleeting shadow, or the echo of a distant conversation could trigger vivid memories of his compositions. Each observer carried a personal imprint, a unique reaction shaped by the interplay of perception, emotion, and memory. Apprentices recognized that their training had granted them knowledge far beyond ordinary musicianship. They understood the delicate balance between precision, human physiology, and psychological manipulation, necessary to recreate even fragments of Vincenzo's effects. Any deviation could result in harm, and the risks were widely acknowledged yet rarely spoken of. Patrons struggled with obsession, unable to resist recalling, replaying, and analyzing the performances they had witnessed. Some were compelled to recreate elements of the music in private, while others abandoned attempts, fearful of mental or emotional collapse. The city itself seemed to act as a repository of lingering resonance. Buildings, halls, and open spaces subtly reinforced memory, perception, and emotional responses. Citizens, often unaware of the musician's history, experienced sensations that mirrored the effects of the organs of flesh. Whispers, shadows, and fleeting melodies became part of daily life, subtly influencing thought and emotion. Scholars, despite meticulous study, could not account for the phenomenon. Observation suggested that Vincenzo had discovered a means to embed influence into both perception and the environment, creating effects that persisted long after direct exposure. Patrons and apprentices documented their experiences, balancing the need for secrecy with the desire to preserve understanding. Fragmented journals, cryptic diagrams, and subtle annotations served as guides for future generations, though full replication remained impossible. Florence's cultural identity became entwined with the legacy. Artistic expression, psychological awareness, and public perception were all subtly informed by the memory of Vincenzo's work. Patrons recognized that his compositions were more than music. They were instruments of perception, emotion, and human experience, leaving an indelible mark on all who encountered them. Children reported inexplicable visions, heightened intuition, and moments of profound emotional resonance. Animals reacted unpredictably, avoiding certain areas or displaying heightened alertness. Residents often experienced involuntary emotional responses to stimuli that would otherwise be mundane. The city itself seemed alive, a living canvas reflecting the enduring impact of the forgotten musician. Patrons who had witnessed the organs of flesh understood that their lives had been irrevocably altered. They carried the music within them, consciously or unconsciously influencing others through emotion, behavior, and subtle gestures. Apprentices, meanwhile, became guardians of knowledge, aware that misuse could result in disaster. Florence's streets and buildings acted as amplifiers, preserving the lingering effects of harmonic resonance across generations. Patrons often felt compelled to revisit memories, replaying compositions in thought or imagination, sustaining the influence of Vincenzo's work. Even those who had no direct contact with the musician's instruments were affected through subtle transmission of perception, culture, and atmospheric resonance. The city became a perpetual stage for the unseen, a living reminder of the extraordinary, terrifying, and lasting power of Vincenzo Moretti. Scholars, patrons, and ordinary citizens alike recognized that understanding was partial at best, yet the influence was undeniable. Memory, emotion, and environment had merged into a single persistent legacy, leaving Florence forever marked by genius and terror. Patrons occasionally attempted to teach or share fragments of knowledge, but only those deemed capable could withstand exposure without harm. Apprentices maintained rigorous discipline, aware that mastery demanded respect, caution, and insight. Patrons, scholars, and witnesses lived with ongoing tension between fascination, reverence, and dread. Vincenzo's music, while silent in the present, continued to shape life, thought, and perception invisibly. Even decades later, residents experienced subtle effects, emotional waves, fleeting visions, or instinctual reactions tied to compositions that no longer played. Florence remained both city and instrument, a vessel for enduring influence. Patrons, apprentices, and observers alike understood that the ending was not a conclusion, it was a continuous living legacy. Vincenzo Moretti had achieved what few could comprehend, a permanent fusion of art, science, and perception, leaving an indelible mark on both individuals and the city itself. The organs of flesh, while absent, had transformed Florence into a city aware, haunted, and subtly orchestrated by memory, resonance, and genius. Patrons carried the weight, the city absorbed the echo, and the legend endured. The forgotten musician's work was complete, not through direct performance but through an ongoing presence felt, remembered, and manifested throughout Florence. His influence, terrifying yet transcendent, remained a permanent aspect of both mind and environment.